Like Smeagol in the ring, I be blinging this thing. It's the best trilly because it made a lot of Billy. Let's talk War of the Ring, the card game, folks. The card freaking game. Prototype copy. What do you need to know about it? Why do I think that this one is the best Lord of the Rings game, board game on the market right now? Let's talk. Yeah, I put that in the beginning. I stand by that. Those are big words, right? Those are huge words. When we're talking about a property as big as Lord of the Rings, an absolutely massive fan base, an absolutely massive following, Stephen Colbert-esque fanaticism going on with this, even on the tabletop side of things, you know, those are weighty words. And when you have weighty words like that, you need to back them up. And this is just a massive, massive shadow that gets cast over anything with this name on the box, right? Fantasy Flight Games is responsible for two of these, the CCG, as well as the more recent campaign scenario app-based game. And that's not even to mention the miniature game that this is taking the namesake of to be able to compare it to as the mainstay of what people are going to inevitably put it up to as a standard bearer for what they want out of a Lord of the Rings game, right? This is a 2, 3, and 4 player card-driven games of the Shadow versus the Free People, with anywhere from 1 to 2 people per side. Now, I specifically mentioned the player count at the beginning here, because typically when you have a game like this, to compare it to the miniature game, to compare it to Star Wars Rebellion, to compare it to anything that has that ubiquitous 2 to 4 player count, right? Especially when it's skirmish, especially when it's potentially head-to-head, a lot of those games are really suited, tailored even, for this player count, and not so much this, right? You know, it's kind of the shared decision making, and that's kind of off-putting. Really, their best is this. And where this one actually allows for, and this, again, was originally, don't get me wrong, this was originally a turnoff. I said, I don't want to play this at 4 people, right? But the main point at the beginning of this video is that this is an accessibility issue, folks. This is an accessibility issue from head to toe, and that's why it's so massive of a point that is going to be overlooked by a vast number of people in that sense. I mean, the problem with the miniatures game, the problem with the deck building CCG game, the problem with the, you know, campaign game, right, is they all have optimal player counts. I mean, whatever they may be. And with this, yes, it does have probably a better player count, but it gives the ability to adapt to your situation much better, I dare say, than the game I was expecting. I say much better than any of those other games. I mean, the CCG model in and of itself is known for the 1 or 2 players. The War of the Rings miniature game is known for 1 versus 1. Let's stay with accessibility before I go into more of the details, because I will get into the details of this and why from the actual gameplay it stands out too. But accessibility, because it doesn't matter how good a game is, right, if you cannot get it played. And when I looked at this and I said, oh geez, this is, you know, a little bit more than I was expecting rulebook wise. Wow, there's a lot of little things in combat and doing it this way and that way and scenarios at the end that you can kind of mix it. I was like, oh, no. There's a reason I don't own War of the Rings, right? It's not because I don't want it. It's not because I can't afford it. It's because it doesn't matter how good a game is if I can't get it played. How long do people complain about the setup in War of the Rings? How long is the actual gameplay? Do you have the optimal setting for both of those things? And to be frank, the yes up here, no down here. And that is where this strikes hard, it strikes fast, and it succeeds. Because although this rulebook is slightly longer than I was expecting, the flow of the game is so smooth. The learning curve is much easier to get into this. And it just works, folks. And that should make you excited if you are looking at one of those other Lords of the Ring games and going, you know, Chris, I can't get into the CCG model. I'm never going to get the 2-player miniature game set up, played repeatedly enough to know all the minutiae of the rules, and just leaving it out, and just the organization and teaching my significant other or my significant opponent the minutiae of the rules as the person teaching the games back and forth, right? I mean, that's a huge dilemma in a game like this. And so to have the adaptability, the portability, and the just frankly, the ability to do this should make you excited. Because it allowed me to even just play with my wife, who has passing interest in Lord of the Rings, but is also not a heavy gamer. And if that doesn't intrigue you and excite you from a game that also is going to offer you depth of play and replayability, because I can hear you guys in the comment section already saying, well, I don't know, you know, you have these pre-made decks and they're not going to be good enough, and the replayability, I'm just not sure. I'll tell you right now, that is both a boon and a curse with a card game, right? How you draw the cards, when you draw them, the timing of them. I mean, this is a card game, folks. A card game. Look. Cards. You're going to be drawing. And just like any card-based system where you are drawing from a limited stack that does not change, you are going to see the same cards again and again. But it's not a bad thing. Because this game, just like another Lord of the Rings game you may be familiar with, these two games, for example, these games benefit from a meta, from an evolution of play where you start to know a little bit of your side, but you start to also know significantly the other side. So the counter moves, the I think you think that I think that you think I'm going to do this. And this takes this thought pattern and instills it into these instead. So it takes what's good about this, it takes what's good about War of the Rings in the larger scope of things, and puts them together. But this is, let me be very clear, neither of those. It's more akin to this than it is War of the Rings, the miniature game. Because you have a limited system. You have a closed loop system that you are going to be utilizing. But this is where the intrigue comes in, because, like I said, at the 2, the 3, and the 4 player counts, you're going to have differences that are unique. Dare I say, even changing the evolution and the dynamic of the game, because it really does allow for you to play against each other and play on the same team, right? Because of the nature of how this is built in the first place. The free peoples on one side and the shadows on the other. There are separate decks that can be disjointed, but also combined together depending on the player count, depending on how epic you want it to be, how long you want it to be, but also who you want to be. And that's really cool. Because I feared with this that it was going to be just a massive, overwhelming amount of stuff. And yes, it is rather text heavy on a fair number of these cards. But at the same time, there are very few cards that you go, wow, what does this do? No, but apart from some strange choices in verbiage in the actual game, like cycling and things like that, you know, just use discard and go with the terminology that has been well established in the card realm for, dare I say, decades. Everything flows smoothly once you know what you're doing. Now, the battling system is going to be probably the most contentious part when we talk about Lord of the Rings, right? And that's always the question. How do you capture a battling system with cards? How do you not just make it a pure numbers game? Because how do you also assign relative strength to your fan favorites versus the underdogs versus just the massive monsters that you are going to inevitably go up against in the mines of Moria or elsewhere, right? Because the strengths are not created equal. So how do you balance that in a card-based system? And that's what it seems to be doing rather cleverly. The two ways that you are going to be interacting as the Free People and the Shadows, you are going to be having each round a path and a battlefield set before you. And depending on the way you are playing, or depending on how grand the scope of the game you want to play, it allows you to customize it. It allows you to tailor it in those manners to include a certain number, which is going to then thus give you options in how you are going to be mitigating, because that also is the problem with card-based systems where you are just drawing, and stuck with, in some way, shape, or form, what you have, whether it be Elrond or Galadriel or anything else in between. This is the clever part of it, is because you alternate on the beginnings of the rounds who is choosing some of these locations when you are given multiple options for, say, a path that you need to take or that you need to go down. And each of these paths, numbered 1 through 9, will give you various options. They may be 2 detriments to the Shadow. They may be 2 positives for the Free People. And so it is not always going to line up with who's choosing. And that, therein lies some of the replayability, but also the dynamic that's there. Are you choosing something that is potentially better for the side that you are on? Or are you choosing something that is potentially worse that you think for the other side? And are you going to choose correctly? How are you going to tactically adapt then when you see said bonus, said effect for that round set in front of you? Because it will change how you interact. The other dynamic that I was a little bit put off with at first, but have grown to be much more in favor of, is the reserve system. Because in this game, you are only allowed to have so many cards in your hand at a time. And at the end of the round, you are only allowed to carry over also a certain number. You are also only drawing a certain number at the beginning of every round. So be mitigating that and choosing how to utilize those cards also becomes very, very important. And you start to realize that sometimes you got to spend for the sake of spending, and sometimes you get the Balrog at the beginning of the game and he can only be used on paths 5 or 6. And so do you discard him and hope that it comes back around? Do you hope that you can reclaim it somehow? Or do you put it in your reserve that early in the game, hoping that you will still be in contention when that path inevitably comes? Because as you are going along these paths and these battlegrounds, they are worth points. And as you win them, you are potentially earning points, especially on the Free Peoples. But as the Shadow tends to be stronger overall, especially as the game lengthens on, thematically incorporated there very well, the overwhelming force of the Juggernaut is not just wasted in these situations, but actually allows you to accumulate points based on overkill, essentially. By how much more you have at a site is how many victory points you can earn. But when you can play them on what round path area is also another contentious point. And I mean that in a very positive way. It's causing a lot of this. It's not just a simple, the concern with any deck builder or anything deck construction wise, right? Especially nowadays with that theme or that mechanic, is that I got all my cards here in my hand. I play this one, then I play this one, and then this one combos into that, and then this one, and then this one, and then this one, and this one, and this one, and this one, and you lose, and you're done, right? No. Choices are, edgingly difficult in this situation, where you will have lots of good, very useful cards, how you choose to use them. Or you can also end up with cards that just do not match the symbols at the battlegrounds or the sites that you need to play. So do you cycle through? Do you change course? Do you save them for later, stockpile elsewhere, and sort of, you know, lose the battle to win the war? And that's probably going to be the biggest frustration, because you have these symbols in the upper left-hand corner of all the cards that designate which faction they are. Free Peoples and Shadows, you know, each have about 4 or 5 or so within them. And so that is the biggest frustration, because inevitably in a card game, you're just not going to draw the right cards during those times. But as someone who likes a little bit of chaos, as someone who is more of a chaotic neutral, if you will, alignment, I think that's great, because it's going to force you to tactically adapt your strategy as you go. It's not just, I'm just going to play this, I'm just going to play this, and this is clearly the answer, right? It reminds me more a little bit with the paths and the battlegrounds of the old Star Wars Decipher CCG, if you will, if you're familiar, if you're old school enough to remember that, where you had the sites lined up in the middle and you stacked your forces on the side and you stacked your forces on the other side, and then they had, depending on if it was a dark side location or a light side location, extra icons on your side and extra icons on the other side. And this is where the iconography is, again, going to be something that is going to give a dynamic that I wasn't expecting, because the icons on these cards sometimes will only be applicable to the battleground. Sometimes they will only be applicable to the path. Sometimes there will be both. Which you choose to play or win depends on what is given in front of you. I mean, there were plenty of times when I was playing with my wife that, you know, I had lost one of them very clearly. She had a couple extra symbols on the Free People side already. She lays down 2 characters down there, or a character with an item, and I have nothing in my hand that's even going to get close. And with the Free People, if you just win it, you get the victory point. So I then mustered my resources on the other to make sure that I could even things out in that way. And that's good, because it doesn't just end up with a round where you just can't do anything. Because that is the biggest frustration with said card games, deck builders, you know, deck constructions, where you just end up with a hand and you go, right? We've all had that. It just spoils the mood. Like everyone else, you know, going around the table is doing something cool, and then you're left with just garbage in your hands, and you chuck the cards and have to wait another couple turns. But no, I mean, the gameplay is very smooth in the sense that I take an action, you take an action. I take an action, you take an action. And I love, let me be very clear about this, the use of card play with the, I'll call this the Marvel Champions system, if you will, where I have to trash a card to play a card. And that is also where the other dynamic is. And so you have to be very careful. Is this worth me having just trashed the other card now? Or is that other card really something that I would have been better off saving for future use? Now, I say trash it, but what you're doing essentially is you're cycling it, which is just discarding it. But your discards are not easily reobtainable. And so with great power comes great responsibility when you are choosing very carefully from your limited supply. And there are some rounds where you will only have 2 or maybe even 3 actions that you do in a single turn. And so some people are going to look at that and go, well, that's not very much. That's not really that exciting, Chris. Why are you even, you know, what? Stupid. No, I mean, believe me, at least from my stance, the actions then are much more meaningful. And that's what we're looking out of a game like this, right? Is we're looking for meaningful decisions up here. Because that is what people love about War of the Rings, the miniature game in the first place, right? Meaningful decisions to say, I just outplayed you, and that's the reason I won. And that, in a card version, with some chaos, with some randomness, is what this captures. but it's doing it in a completely different way, which is why I can see people who are only basing it off of the name alone and associating it with the other are not going to like it in that sense, because there is those elements that I just went through that you are not going to have easy control of, and it's going to frustrate people who are approaching it more like a strictly Euro skirmish game where, you know, they have control of everything. They are pulling the strings across the board with everything. And this is not that. But that's the nature of a card-based game. Is it doing what it set out to do? Yeah. Some people that are going into it with other expectations are not going to like it from that aspect if you don't realize it. Just like if you go by root and you think it's going to be something other than what it is, right? You have to know what it is you're getting into. And if you know what you're getting into with this one, it's going to fly, in my opinion, with smashing colors. The other dynamic that I did not mention from the battles, which again is going to be a very divisive one in this sense, is if you are on a certain faction in a certain battlefield, I mean, and thematically it makes very good sense, and you say lose the battle as the free people, your cards are not cycled. Your cards are trashed. So that's the other element. When you play some of these cards, you have to be willing to commit them and willing to lose them for the rest of the game with no chance of returning them from your cycling or your discard pile, essentially, except for a few rare cases. And that makes the important decisions all that much more important. Is the combat system explained as well, as fluidly as I would like in the rulebook? No, I mean, there are minor things in there that just, you know, just the way they're worded and just, again, some of the verbiage that gets thrown in the rulebook makes it a little bit harder to grasp just at first. But once you play through a game as the starting scenario in here, you'll get the flow of things as well rather quickly. One of the things you may not like that I'm sort of mixed on as well are some of the items, right? As a thematic incorporation, you've got some very well-known named items, especially on the free people side of things. And items can only be equipped sometimes to certain people. And so if you just don't get each of those items at the same time, you know, again, there's not as much mitigation there. I mean, there are some special effects that are like, okay, hey, if this person is in, or if this card is in your discard pile, when you play this one, go and get that one. So, I mean, there's some of that, but there were times where, you know, especially as the free peoples, there were a few more items that my wife couldn't play because she just didn't have the right person at the right time. They were in the discard pile. They'd already been trashed, or, you know, something else in between. They were even in the deck still, and or maybe the deck was the only place she could get them from, and they were already elsewhere. So the items aren't probably as useful, but when you can utilize them, they do add a significant amount. It's just your mileage may vary probably with that one. The other interesting aspect of battling is you'll have characters like Saruman, for example, that have multiple icons, including icons that are circled, which are called leadership icons. But in order for them to participate in the battle, they have to have someone that they're actually leading. So some of these very strong characters will not actually be able to participate significantly or to a significant degree unless they actually have someone else on the field, which sort of makes these extremely powerful cards a little bit, you know, handicapped at the same time. For example, Saruman can only be played in certain paths. So it's not like I can just have Saruman out and anytime I'm losing, just take him out from reserve and whip him into any battle and win. He has to have someone of the same faction that he is leading, and he can only be on certain paths. So it doesn't just give you a, you know, you can use this super powerful guy anywhere, anytime, anyway, to sort of throw the balance of the game off. You know, there is the thematic incorporation, just like you see with some of the areas as you're moving around on the map for these games as well. So that's a nice tie-in in that sense. As a side note, I'm just going to totally throw this out there as an end note that I actually really liked, because one of my big pet peeves when it comes to IP-based games, right? When you have these IP-based games, you have these cards, and oftentimes they take crappy stills or pictures from movies or shows and they put them on the cards, right? This artwork is great because they did not do that. individual art that is unique on all of these. I mean, you can't really, mine have demo written on them in, the background, so you don't get the full working of what it is. But the fact that they went that way as well is just icing on the cake for this. So final thoughts on this one. I went into this game, again, I am a relatively decent Lord of the Rings fan. I'm not, huge by any means. And so I looked at this as, like I mentioned at the beginning, a game that, okay, well, I can't get the other game played. I can't get the other games out there played. I mean, they're lifestyle games, right? And I feared when I got this, that this was going to be just that of a different, shape, variety, ilk, whatever you want to say. And now having played this, I will say that this fills a niche that I didn't know that I needed, because I am a big 1 versus 1 skirmish player, if you've watched other videos on my channel. And I really enjoy that type of game. Whether it's Exceed, Yomi, BattleCon, Ivion, Token Terrors, any of those 1 versus 1s, with some take that, with some card play, with some tactical nature, right? And I was like, well, is this going to overlap? Is this going to be, this is great. And the other thing that I'm going to throw in here that I have no advanced knowledge about, but could easily see, these decks, you have them pre-made that I mentioned at the beginning. And so you have a set deck and you start to know it and you start to get used to it and you start to know when things are coming, or, what you need in sort of meta evolving situations. But, and just like with Ares' other game, the War of the Ring, the miniature game, a few sprinklings of expansions, a few sprinklings of extras. And I could see where extras could very well easily be incorporated without, because this is always the big concern with anything like that, the significant amount of overhead, the changing of the dynamic of the rules or the game as a whole, or just frankly allowing you a little bit of customization if that is the one thing that you are looking at this and going, well, it doesn't have that, Chris, so therefore I don't want it. I can't deck create a la Marvel Champions or Lord of the Rings LCG, if you will. And I could see this being very much in the lines with future product line. It would not shock me one bit, and I think it would be very well-fitting and very easily incorporated in both ways. So there you go. All in all, I'm super impressed by this. This is easily going to be a top 10 game of the year for me. I'll tell you that right now. Easily. So I don't have enough plays in it right now to, tell you anything more than that. But I can tell you right now, it's going to be a keeper. It's going to be a solid keeper. And I'm just really impressed that they could do this. And I hope that they have more plans for this, like I mentioned, with a few trinkets here and there, because it's ripe for that, to give a little bit on both sides. Because you could easily have slightly larger decks without having too much of a, the big deck syndrome of not being able to get the things you need. You could easily add 5 or 10, even maybe 10 cards, but you could easily swap out 5 cards too and have that very nice tight deck that people like as well, so that you can get in and get through all the good stuff. Because if there's nothing else more frustrating in a deck building game, I'm looking at you, Marvel Legendary, is it's never getting to the good stuff in the first place and being able to play it. So there you go. Those are my thoughts. War of the Ring, the card game. Freaking sweet. Check it out. Thanks, Ares, sending me the demo copy to be able to talk to you guys about in the first place. Hopefully you like it. If you have any questions, let me know what you think. I'm open to comments or questions down below. As always, stay classy. Have a great day. Click subscribe if you're not. Help me help you. Thanks for watching in the first place, though. I appreciate it. See you around.